Okay, so in this video, we're going to go over some of the common organelles of a eukaryotic cell. Now, an organelle is simply a word that means small part. So just like the body has small parts called organs, cells have small parts called organelles. Well, there's a lot of them, so let's go ahead and get started. First thing I want to mention are the three basic sections to the cell. And all cells need to take in food, get rid of waste, and reproduce. Well, cells have three main sections to them, and inside of those three sections are parts that allow them to take in food, get rid of waste, and reproduce. So the first section you can see highlighted by the flashing black line, the plasma membrane. You might also hear the plasma membrane simply called the cell membrane. We'll talk more about this in a little bit. Pulsing in the picture, you can see the second main section, the nucleus. You often hear the nucleus called the control center. We'll explain why in a little bit. And lastly, we have the cytoplasm. Now, the arrow in the picture looks like it's kind of just pointing to empty space. Well, cells are not filled with empty space. They're filled with a part called the cytoplasm. We'll go into that in more detail. Let's actually do the cytoplasm first. Here we go. So the cytoplasm, the first thing I want to mention is that it's the jelly-like material on the inside of the cell. You know, when you look at diagrams, sometimes in a diagram a cell might look like it's empty or filled with hollow air space, and that's not true. Cells are filled with a jelly-like liquidy material called the cytoplasm, and in that cytoplasm most organelles float within. You can see here's a list of a few of the organelles that are floating around in the cytoplasm. We're going to go and talk about all of these throughout this video. We'll talk about what the mitochondria is, what lysosomes are. And because the cytoplasm is a jelly-like material and things are floating around inside of it, you often, under a microscope, can actually see parts floating around. In this animation here, you can see what's known as cytoplasmic streaming. The green circles that are drifting around inside of the square cells, the rectangular shaped cells, those green circles are plant cell chloroplasts. You can see in every rectangular shaped plant cell there's a few dozen chloroplasts in each of these cells here. And this is known as cytoplasmic streaming. Okay, well, what about the job? What does the cytoplasm actually do? Well, a lot of chemical reactions take place within the cell, and chemical reactions take place in the cytoplasm. So that's kind of what the job of the cytoplasm is. It helps to facilitate chemical reactions, and it also helps to dissolve solutes, particles that are in the cell, carbohydrates, proteins. These are all dissolved within the actual cytoplasm of the cell. So that's really what the main function of the cytoplasm is. It also adds support to the cell, a pressure support for the cell. So the next part I want to mention is called the plasma membrane, also known as the cell membrane. And first of all, its composition means what is it made from? It's a bilayer of lipids and proteins. Earlier in the school year, we learned about lipids. And this is a drawing of a very simple lipid here. The round part represents the head. The two tails are the fatty acids. And what we mean by a bilayer, it's not just one layer, but two layers on top of one another. This is a bilayer of lipids right here. In between the bilayer of lipids are also proteins. I've labeled this protein channel, and you're going to see its importance in a moment. Well, the job of the plasma membrane is to allow materials to pass, to enter and exit. You know, small molecules like water and oxygen, H2O for water, O2 for oxygen, small molecules like this can simply pass through the lipid bilayer. However, larger molecules like glucose, have to pass through these protein channels, and that's what you see happening in the animation. And so that's really the job of the cell membrane. But the cell membrane is what we call semi-permeable or selectively permeable. And that means that it doesn't allow everything in and out. It only allows certain specific molecules and ions and charged particles to enter or exit through the plasma membrane. So when we come back to this picture we saw earlier, here we have the next part I want to mention. You can see the black square highlighting the nucleus. Let's zoom on in for a closer look. When we zoom on in, here we have the nucleus. And you've heard maybe in middle school that the job of the nucleus is to control the cell's activity. You often hear it given the nickname of the headquarters. Well, what does that mean? Well, the reason we call the nucleus the headquarters is because it contains DNA. And in the picture, we see 5 twisted strands of what is called chromatin. Chromatin are long strands of DNA. And DNA is the instructions, the blueprint, the manual on how to make proteins. And this is why we call the nucleus the control center, is because the chromatin will be sending out information to make proteins. And proteins do a lot of the work. The vast majority of the work inside of our cells, inside of our bodies, are performed by proteins. So this is why the nucleus gets the nickname of the control center. Also inside the nucleus, there's a round object known as the nucleolus. And the job of the nucleolus is to make another part of a cell, another organelle, called the ribosome. So the job of the nucleolus is to make ribosomes, and we're going to see what ribosomes do in just a moment. When we look at this picture right here, we can see a nice electron microscope picture. The overall round object is the nucleus. You can see the dark spot is the nucleolus. A really nice picture here of the nucleus and the nucleolus. So we come back here, we have the box highlighting the rough ER and the smooth ER. Let's zoom on in and take a closer look at the endoplasmic reticulum. Okay, first of all, there's 2 kinds of ER. Let's look at the rough ER first. The ER stands for endoplasmic reticulum. The rough ER, the reason it's called rough is that it's covered in ribosomes. So we mentioned a moment ago that the nucleolus makes ribosomes. The ribosomes then exit the nucleus and travel along this tunnel system known as the rough ER. And that's kind of the job of the rough ER, is to receive the ribosomes and transport and carry around the ribosomes from one part of the cell to another. As you can see, we finally see what the job of a ribosome is. Protein-making ribosomes. So that's the job of a ribosome, is to make a protein. So the rough ER will transport the ribosomes as the ribosomes are making a protein. Well, if we look at this picture here, we have the purple nucleus. Identify part A in the nucleus. I hope you know that's the nucleolus. The lines, the purple lines identified by letter B, that's the DNA. I hope you remember the name of the DNA. That's called chromatin. And then the outside of the nucleus in picture C. I never mentioned the name earlier, but that's called the nuclear envelope. Notice how the blue is the rough ER, and there's gray dots all over it. Well, look in the animation. You see gray dots exiting the nucleolus in the animation. And those gray dots are traveling through the blue rough ER. That means those gray dots have to be the ribosomes. The job of ribosomes are to make proteins. We're going to go into more on that in just a few moments. So what about the smooth ER? Well, if the rough ER is covered in ribosomes, then a little common sense, the smooth ER is not covered in ribosomes. And you can see it has a different job. The job of the smooth ER is to help make lipids and fats and to help break down certain toxins. But the reason it gets its name smooth ER is it's not covered in ribosomes. The rough ER is covered in ribosomes, and that's why it kind of has a rough appearance to it. So let's talk a few extra moments about those things called ribosomes. They're created by the nucleolus. Remember, the nucleolus is inside the nucleus. They're transported. The ribosomes are transported by the rough ER, and as the ribosomes are being transported by the rough ER, we now come to their job, their duty. Their function is to make proteins. And so if we highlight a few ribosomes with that flashing black box, let's zoom on in to a ribosome that's attached to the rough ER. Well, here we have a ribosome. And the reason, what I mentioned a moment ago, is its job is to make a protein. And what it does is it will gather individual amino acids. And earlier in the school year, I hope you remember that amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. And so here we see a ribosome is gathering and connecting a bunch of amino acids into a long chain. This long chain of amino acids is what we call a protein, and that's the job of a ribosome, is to gather and build these amino acids into a larger protein. This process, by the way, is known as translation. We're going to learn about it later in the school year, though. So if we come back out here to our diagram, I've highlighted the flashing box of the Golgi body. Let's zoom on in to the Golgi body. You might often hear it called the Golgi apparatus or the Golgi complex. It's always going to be called Golgi because it's named after the scientist with the last name of Golgi who discovered it. And so the job of the Golgi body is to receive proteins that ribosomes made, modify them, sort them, and package them so they can be exported from the cell. And the Golgi body will put the proteins into a protective little envelope known as a vesicle. And so let's go ahead and review what we've learned really quick. When we look at the process of shipping out of protein, in our animation we can see the nucleolus is releasing a black dot. That black dot represents a ribosome. So the nucleolus makes a ribosome. Notice that ribosome then travels through that rough ER, that system of tubes and tunnels. So the ribosome is traveling through the rough ER making a protein. Well, let's zoom on in for a closer look. So there's the ribosome. Okay, now that we can see the ribosome, remember what the job of a ribosome is. It makes a protein. And so there you see the word protein. Now it's spelled P-R-O-T-E-I-N, but it's not really put together properly. So this protein is not quite finished, even though the ribosome made it. Well, watch what happens next. Remember, this is all happening at the rough ER. The protein is going to be placed inside of a protective vesicle and travel away. Where is it going? I hope you know where it's going. It's going to a Golgi body. And so the protein arrives at the Golgi body. What happens to the vesicle? The vesicle fuses and becomes a part of the Golgi body. Well, watch what happens. The protein moves through the Golgi body and is eventually processed and modified and ultimately is going to be released. So the Golgi body kind of makes the final changes to the protein. Well, when the Golgi body releases the protein, it also will put it in a protective vesicle. So the vesicle is going to be a protective little envelope. Watch this. The protein is put into a protective vesicle and it's released. The vesicle fuses with the cell membrane, and then the protein is simply released from the cell, goes where it's needed. All right, so if we were in class, I would have you turn to your neighbor and try to work on these review questions. So we've kind of covered a lot of information. Let's take a quick moment, pause the video, try to answer these 7 questions. I'm going to go over the answers in 3, 2, 1. So which organelle builds proteins? I hope you know that's a ribosome. Which organelle stores DNA? Well, that's the control center called the nucleus. Which organelle produces ribosomes? Well, that's the nucleolus. It's found inside the nucleus. Which organelle creates fats and breaks down toxins? Well, that's the smooth ER. Which organelle, number 5, packages and releases proteins from a cell? Well, that's the Golgi body. Remember, they're put inside of a protective vesicle. Number 6, which organelle allows materials to enter and exit a cell? Well, that's the cell membrane, also called the plasma membrane. Number 7, which organelle links chains of amino acids together? Well, that's the same thing as question number 1. Question number 1 and question number 7. It's the same question, just worded a little differently because amino acids make proteins. Let's try this one. Same thing in class. I would have you work on this with a neighbor for a minute, but pause the video. Try to put these 4 steps in order. What comes first, second, third, fourth? I'm going to show the answer in 3, 2, 1. Okay. So the answer is, I hope you chose step C first. The nucleolus makes ribosomes. And then I hope you chose D. Ribosomes will exit the nucleus. And then I hope you chose B, the ribosomes are going to travel along the rough ER and create proteins. And then finally, I hope you chose A, the Golgi body will package and export the finished protein inside of a protective vesicle. Let's move on. So now we're back to our diagram, and I've highlighted the flashing box, the mitochondria. Let's zoom on in for a closer look. Here we have the mitochondria. Artist drawing on top, actual picture on the bottom. And so the job of the mitochondria, you know, in middle school they give cute little nicknames to cell parts. In middle school you may have been told this is the powerhouse, but you may never have been told why. Well, it's the powerhouse because its job is to make an energy molecule by the name of adenosine triphosphate, ATP. So the mitochondria does a very important process known as cellular respiration. And during the process of cellular respiration, it will create an energy molecule by the name of ATP. ATP is a molecule used by your cells for energy. So the analogy is the mitochondria is kind of like the battery of your cells. What's interesting about the mitochondria is we're pretty certain the mitochondria used to be a living organism. It used to be basically a bacteria cell. But it has become part of today's modern cells. And this theory of how we think this happened is called endosymbiosis. I'll go over in more detail in just a moment. Well, when we look at some of the evidence for why we think the mitochondria used to be its own living organism is because it has its own DNA. It has its own ribosomes. Because it has its own ribosomes, it can manufacture its own proteins. And the mitochondria does something very important to life. The mitochondria can reproduce and replicate. So when you look at this evidence, we're pretty certain the mitochondria used to be a free living organism, a bacteria species. But it's become part of cells. Well, how did that happen? That's what endosymbiosis tries to explain. I hope I can visualize that on the next slide. Okay, so I really want to try to visualize the endosymbiosis theory. Here we have a large predator cell in orange that's going to devour that red mitochondria ancestor. Watch this. So there it goes. It just devoured the mitochondria ancestor. But the way we think it happened is that red mitochondria survived and divided and multiplied. It's just trapped inside of the large predator cell. Well, as the two go about their lives, the large predator cell eventually is going to multiply and divide as well. And watch this. When cells divide, they often grow, and then they split right down the middle, and now you have two cells. Two cells with the mitochondria ancestors trapped inside of them. And then the process simply continues. So the mitochondria ancestors keep multiplying, and then the orange predator cell divides in half. And over time, over millions and millions of years, the two have become so dependent on one another that they can't survive without them. So this is kind of what the endosymbiosis theory it tries to explain, is how cells became more complex. How did we obtain certain cell parts? And this is the explanation for how we think the mitochondria was obtained. Okay, let's zoom on in. Let's focus on the lysosomes back in our diagram here. Let's zoom on in for a closer look at the lysosomes. And so the lysosomes contain inside of them very powerful digestive enzymes. And that's what my little animated scissors here are showing. So the blue circle is the lysosome with the animated scissors representing the enzymes inside. And so lysosomes have various jobs. Number one is to break down food. So here we have a protein molecule that's being taken into the cell, and the protein is being broken down into smaller parts. I hope you know those smaller parts are called amino acids. Here we have an example of a white blood cell. You probably know white blood cells' job is to fight off infections like bacteria and viruses. Well, that's what we call pathogens. Things that cause disease are called pathogens. And so here's a virus or a bacteria, and notice how it just landed on a white blood cell. Well, what happens is the white blood cell will swallow up that pathogen, put it inside of a lysosome, and those powerful digestive enzymes will destroy it. So that's one way that our immune system keeps us healthy. And then there's the process called autolysis, where it's basically an aging cell will destroy itself. And so in the middle of our picture here, we have a group of cells, and I have the animated scissors, because what happens is when cells are dying and aging, they will kind of self-destruct in a process called autolysis, where the lysosomes will release all the digestive enzymes and kill that cell. It leaves behind a gap, but don't worry, that gap will simply be filled in as cells multiply. So you've heard the expression, out with the old, in with the new. A couple other cell parts I want to mention are used in movement, and that's the job of cilia and flagella. Now, not all cells move, so not all cells have cilia and flagella. But if cells move, they probably have either cilia or flagella. So the picture on the left shows the cilia, short hair-like extensions. There's numerous, hundreds and thousands of them per cell. Way too many to count. Very short, stubby, almost look like eyelashes. They're so short and stubby. The picture on the right shows a sperm cell with a real long flagella. Flagella is actually the plural version. Flagellum is singular. And so the difference is really their length. The cilia, short, stubby. Flagella are long and whip-like, and usually there's only a few of them. Maybe only one flagellum, maybe two, maybe three, maybe four, but not nearly as many as the cilia. Well, in that picture on the right, we have a sperm cell about to penetrate a female egg cell to create a fertilized egg, also known as a zygote. Let's have a little fun with this. So, after the sperm fertilizes the egg, that fertilized egg is going to grow into a fetus. Here we have a nice little ultrasound showing a child growing inside of a pregnant woman. Well, eventually, 9 months later, that child's going to be born. Well, let's follow the life of this child. 17 years go by. 17 years later, hey, it's your first day at high school. And so here you go. Welcome to high school. And hopefully 4 years after that, you'll be celebrating your graduation from high school. So this all started because of that flagella that provided the swimming movement to fertilize an egg. So we look at the next part I want to mention is the cell wall. And so this is the outermost layer of plants, fungus, and bacteria cells. So from left to right, we have plants, fungi, and bacteria. Notice animals, like humans, do not have a cell wall. Well, we also mentioned that the cell wall is the outermost layer. So when we look at this picture, we have a yellow layer and a green layer. So I hope you know that yellow layer represents the plasma membrane, or the cell membrane. And in the definition, we see that the outermost layer is the cell wall. So that's represented by the green layer. Well, what about its job? One of the jobs of the cell wall is to add support. It's made from a real tough, sturdy material known as cellulose. And so this adds some of the support to plants and fungus and bacteria cells that have. And so, as I just mentioned, the cell wall is made from a real tough material by the name of cellulose. It's very hard to digest. The reason for the picture is celery has a lot of cellulose in it. And I'm sure you've had bites of celery. It's a very tough, very fibrous plant, very hard to digest. Well, that's because you're having to chew through a lot of cellulose, which is a main ingredient of the cell wall. And the cell wall really started our understanding of cells. Earlier in another video, we learned that Robert Hooke in 1665, again, there's no real good pictures of Robert Hooke, so here we just have a stained glass picture in a cathedral. Robert Hooke in 1665 examined cork. And so he used a very primitive microscope, like this one in this picture here, and as I mentioned a moment ago, he examined cork. Now cork, we might be familiar with cork from, wine bottles, but cork is actually tree bark. And he examined a real thin slice of tree bark called cork, and this is what he saw. In this picture here is a drawing that he made. It's kind of shocking to believe that this picture right here is a drawing made by hand, but that's how good of an artist he was. And what you see are hundreds of little tiny cells, but the outline of the cell is all that's left. he did a drawing of the cell wall. There was no nucleus. The cork in tree bark is dead. There was no nucleus when he made the drawing. There were no mitochondria, no vacuoles. All that's left, and all you can see in the picture, is the drawing of the cell wall. The cell wall is very tough, very strong, and can last for years and years after the cells have died. So the next part I want to mention is called the chloroplasts. And so you might know the job of the chloroplast is to perform photosynthesis. Well, here are several dozen plant cells taken with a microscope. Let's zoom on in for a closer look. When we zoom on in, we can see that inside of every cell are dozens of those green round-shaped objects called chloroplasts. They're inside every single cell, and there's dozens of them per cell. So you know that the job of the chloroplast is to perform photosynthesis. Well, inside of the chloroplast is a chemical, a green chemical by the name of chlorophyll. The job of chlorophyll is to actually perform photosynthesis. It will absorb sunlight, absorb carbon dioxide, absorb water, and turn those into oxygen and sugar, particularly in the form of glucose. So what photosynthesis does is it uses three ingredients: water, carbon dioxide, sunlight, and will release two products: oxygen and sugar called glucose. Just like the mitochondria, the chloroplast is thought to have evolved and become a cell part according to the endosymbiosis theory. We think the chloroplast was also a free-living organism, a bacteria. In our animation, here we have a predator cell devouring the chloroplast, but not really being digested. That chloroplast ancestor in green multiplies, just like we saw a moment ago with the mitochondria ancestors. And notice how the two are just living together. The green chloroplast ancestors are just trapped inside of the larger one. Well, as time goes by, the larger cell divides and splits into two, and as years go by, these two have become so dependent on one another that they are now a part of each other. And the evidence to support this is, again, the chloroplasts, just like the mitochondria, have their own DNA and ribosomes. They make their own proteins. They can replicate and multiply and divide. These are all real strong indicators that the chloroplasts were probably once a free-living organism all by itself, but has become taken into the cell and become part of modern cells. So the final one, the last part I want to mention, is called the vacuole. The job of the vacuole is to store food, store water, waste, color pigments, and in the picture here you can see it's the big blue round object in the middle of the cell. Often, in plants that is, it's often the largest part of a plant cell. So in plants, it's often the largest central, meaning in the middle. So we often think of the nucleus being in the middle of a cell. Well, often the vacuole is, because it's so big, it pushes all the other parts to the edges. When we look at this little animation right here, again, I mentioned cytoplasmic streaming earlier here. The green circles represent chloroplasts, but they're all kind of revolving around the central vacuole. And so the central vacuole is often so big it will push the other organelles to the edge of the cell. So in plants, there tends to be a large central vacuole, but it's not like that with animal cells. Here's a diagram, a drawing of an animal cell, and the vacuoles are much smaller, and they're usually randomly scattered throughout the cytoplasm, but they still serve the same purpose. They still store food, store water, store waste, and so that's really the job of the vacuole right there. Well, so there you have it. I mean, there's a lot of cell parts that we covered in this video here, so try and pause the video and work through these questions. If you're in my biology class, bring your answers on a separate sheet of paper. I'd be happy to check your accuracy either before school or after school. Good luck.